Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're having a great week. I'd like to discuss Dead Girls by Selva Almada, which is an excellent book. It's true crime, it's nonfiction, and it has the journalist's inquiry lens that is true to really excellent true crime. But Almada is also a short story writer and a novelist, and so her sensibility is just filling these pages. There's a sense of poetic realism to this book. It's a book that examines on a very deep and unsettling level the femicides, the murders of 3 young women, adolescent girls in rural Argentina. And there's a very personal nature to it, and we find this out right away because Almada herself remembers one of these murders. It occurred in her town when she herself was young, and so there is a deeply personal sense to the investigation, the questions she's asking, the travels she makes as an adult, and there's a real sense of dread and fear that exists throughout the book, and she makes that very clear early on. I was 13, and that morning the news about the dead girl hit me like a revelation. My house, any teenager's house, wasn't really the safest place in the world. You could be killed inside your own home. Horror could live with you under your roof. In the days that followed, I learned more details. The girl's name was Andrea Dane. She was 19, blonde, pretty, with blue eyes. She had a boyfriend and was training to be a psychology teacher. Someone had stabbed her in the heart. For more than 20 years, Andrea was always close by. And that sense is just so real within the book. This feeling that right away we get a quick description of that day. They're out grilling, there's a light rain, and she's out there, Selva's out there with her father, and then the news comes. And so she describes in 3 pages that day and then gives that final paragraph sharing her own horror, this sense of this struck me and it has truly never left me. For 20 years I've been thinking about it. And this book ultimately becomes the result of that. She examines Andrea, she examines Maria Luisa, and she examines Sarita, each of whom have very different experiences. Some are students, some, one works, has a job as a cleaner, Andrea's going to school. And so there's all of these different walks of life the women have. Their personal lives, their backgrounds, their family lives are each unique. But they all are united in the fact that they ultimately, are victims. They're murder victims, and that exploration of what does link these, what links these within a society. How do the families move on? How do Almada makes this note of the family member who sort of becomes the spokesperson, the person who wants to continue being the voice for the sibling generally. Who has been lost throughout the book, and it's so personal, but there's a sense of dread, there's a sense of fear and dread where when Almada's going to do these investigations, when she's going into the edge of town where a body had been found, or going into a part of town that might feel unsafe, we feel her sense of being unsafe as a writer, and as a human being. And that made it a very, very unique reading experience, and one that I highly, highly recommend. But there's also, and as an example of that, a taxi driver agrees begrudgingly to take me to the outskirts of Science Peña. It's midday and the sun is splitting above us like a ripe cheese. The guy would rather be at home by now than crossing the city, dodging the packs of scooters that buzz along, clogging the full width of the roads. On the way, I try to convince him to wait for me, just for a bit, 15 minutes at most, but he says no. No, lady, I'm already off duty, but I'll send a car later if you like. I say yes, though I doubt he'll send anyone, or that anyone will want to come at this hour, when everyone's going to sleep, when the city is dying, until 5 o'clock. And so it goes on. I haven't finished closing the door, and already he's making a U-turn and disappearing at full speed in a cloud of dust. To one side of me, there's a social housing development, identical little houses, all painted white, blinding where they reflect the sun, all with identical water tanks on the roof. On the other side, a rubbish tip, a shimmering swamp, blue and green from the flies. A dog every now and then nosing around in the piles of trash. It smells foul. The other 2 corners of the intersection are empty lots, covered in weeds. Maria Luisa Quevedo's body was thrown into one of these 4 bits of land, but which? I look around, a bit disoriented. There's no one here. In some places, noon feels more frightening than the dead of night. For something to do, I take a few photos with a little camera I have in my rucksack. I don't know why the landscape's grim and desolate. I tell myself it's so I can remember it later, but I know I'll never download the photos, that most likely I'll delete them or lose them. And she goes on to ask, she encounters someone and asks, do you know where the body was found? And the woman proceeds to point out a place. Oh, it was right over there. And then it turns out that was the body of another young woman who'd been murdered. And that is the horror that exists across this. At one point, it's discovered, and there's pretty clear evidence that the remains that had been found, that they were convinced was all that was left of one victim, turn out to not have a DNA match. And someone, as the family is crying and weeping, one of them realizes, as horrified as they are at this sense of unknowing and loss that they still have, that means that there's some other family out there who's also experiencing that. And so the book was wrenching to read, but also just utterly timely and such a valuable book to examine and explore, and one that I'll certainly return to. Almada is an amazing writer, and so I'm really interested in reading her novel, The Wind That Lays Waste, which is also published by Charco Press, a press I discovered that publishes works from Latin America. And so I'm fascinating and very interested to read more from Selva Almada. And it was translated by Annie McDermott, who's also translated some works for Charco Press. Now, the book, I think, has drawn some comparisons to Part 4 in Roberto Bolaño's 2666, the part about the crimes. And I understand why, but I think that Almada captures something that Bolaño really tries to ensure that the reader of 2666, who's attentive, is not losing empathy for the victims who are more than cataloged. They're given identities, they're given backgrounds, they're given lives, they're given final moments. What they're often not given is justice. And Bolaño is very careful to craft Part 4 in such a way that an attentive reader who can persevere does not lose empathy for those victims. But there's something different about Dead Girls, and I think it's the sense that for Almada it is so much more personal. She feels that at any moment she could have been one of those young women. But the other books that I was reminded of, certainly 1977 or 1974 by David Peace, his fictional books exploring the Yorkshire Ripper. There even being the comparison of in both books, characters in the novel and real individuals in Dead Girls had gone and sought a medium to provide hope and context. Another one that comes to mind would be Resurrection Man by Eoin McNamee. Primarily the sense of place, the way that we get to know these small towns, we get to know the corners around them, the parks or the rivers, and the roads that exist between them. And then Derek Raymond's He Died with His Eyes Open, the way that when there's so little to go on with a murder, how little pieces are they try to piece those little puzzles together. The other two books, there's a sense of Greek tragedy to it, in the sense of the way that right away we know who these people are, who these three women are, who their families are, and we know what happened to them. We just don't know who did it, and we don't know if there will ever be justice or resolution. And that, to a certain extent, is how Euripides writes his Greek tragedies. We know right away from the chorus what's going to happen and some motivation for it. We're now going to see some unfolding, and we're going to see that unfold written through incredible language. And the other one would be Zama by Antonio di Benedetto, not just because so much of this takes place in Paraguay and rural Argentina, as did Dead Girls, but because Almada crafted a book exploring the filming of Zama by Lucrecia. What was her last name? Martel? I've seen it. Yeah, Lucrecia Martel's filming Zama. And so that there was sort of a double parallel there. But this was a book that I highly recommend. It's one that I certainly am going to reread. And I'm certainly interested in reading more from Almada. So this was another great selection for Women in Translation Month. And I hope everybody's having a great week. Thanks.